Greetings, folks. What I want to do today is finish off talking about the flatworms, the phylum Platyhelminthes, by talking about really the biggest group of flatworms, and that is the parasitic flatworms. So, just as a reminder, we're on the tree of life here, uh, talking about metazoans all semester long. The first of which, the peripherans, are certainly thought to be the most basal or ancient group of animals, and we've passed them, past the cnidarians, past the comb jellies, and now we're talking about the bilaterally symmetrical animals, the Platyhelminthes. And right away, if you look at the slide, you'll see there's a little bit of an interesting twist here. It turns out that flatworms in the phylum Platyhelminthes are right here, but there's another group that I hinted about last time. There is a group of flatworms called the aceles, or acela, right over here. So clearly, flatworm-like body plan or bowel plan has evolved at least twice. So in general, then, we're going to be talking about the internal parasites and their adaptations today. These flatworms tend to have adhesive organs, suckers, hooks, teeth to attach to the inside of their prey, sometimes inside of their gut. I'm sorry, I used the word prey. They're inside of their host. They really don't kill the host, so they're not predators. And they oftentimes have no gut. They simply absorb the food that they're literally sitting amongst in the digestive tract of their host through the body wall. They have an outer body wall, or tegument, which is syncytial. That's a multinucleated cell, and it protects them from being digested and allows them, of course, to absorb food material from their host. These worms, flatworms, have a very large reproductive capacity. As you'll see in a moment, they really are spectacularly successful at producing lots of offspring. They don't need much in the way of sense organs sitting inside of someone else's gut, so that's reduced. They have a very complex life cycle to go from one host to the other that we'll be mostly talking about today with mobile larvae. So last time we talked about the first class, the free-living class Turbellaria, with roughly 4,500 species, all free-living. You'll notice here in number 1 that includes a cluster of groups of animals, triclads, polyclads, macrostomids, which are not all branching together. So this is a paraphyletic grouping here, this class. Today we're going to be talking about the trematodes, the class Trematoda here, right here, and the class Monogenea, and finally the class Cestoda, the tapeworms. So let's start out with the class Trematodus. This is a group found in the subclass Digenea because there are 2 hosts usually that they go through, a definitive host and an intermediate host. They commonly affect the health of the hosts, and that certainly includes humans when they're parasitic inside of a human. They're endoparasitic, they're inside of their host. They have very complex life cycles, as I mentioned, with multiple hosts, at least 2. The definitive host, the host that they reach maturity in and reproduce sexually in, is usually a vertebrate animal. And they're very diverse. There's at least 11,000 species, probably many more. And what I've shown you in this slide is a photograph of a whole mount of a Chinese liver fluke on the right, and a diagram showing the internal anatomy of that same Chinese liver fluke down below here. You'll notice that at the head end or oral end, there's a sucker with an opening mouth leading to a very simple digestive tract, simply branched in 2 here, blind-ended, so they have an incomplete digestive tract. There's also a ventral sucker here to help them to hang on inside of the host, and then most of the internal anatomy is represented by both male and female parts. So there's testes here, and ovaries here, and uterus, and they're very good at producing lots of offspring. I mentioned, of course, the suckers. There's anterior sucker here and a ventral sucker, again for attachment to the host. The mouth is on the anterior end, and the body is covered by this outer protective coating called a tegument that avoids digestion by enzymes and also absorbs nutrients from the host. So the typical life cycle of a Digenean flatworm involves multiple hosts, as I mentioned. There's the definitive host, might be a vertebrate like this bird right here. which will release the eggs that are produced by the sexually reproducing worms inside of it. Those eggs will hatch out into miracidia, which will burrow into a first, in this case, intermediate host, which is oftentimes a snail. Inside the snail, there'll be a series of replicative uh, uh, um, stages, so that miracidium will give rise to sporocysts. Inside the sporocyst, there'll be numerous rhedia. Inside each rhedia, there'll be numerous cercaria. It's kind of like a set of Russian dolls, really. And finally, the cercaria are released and invade the second intermediate host and encyst in that host, which is often a fish. And then finally, the vertebrate host will eat that fish raw. So the definitive host, again, is the place where the adult stays, the adult trematode or fluke worm is found. So in general, then, we have a definitive host, some sort of vertebrate, with the adult trematode in it, releasing an egg. That egg develops into a miracidium larva in the water, and then invades the first intermediate host, often a snail, invades into its digestive gland, becomes a sporocyst, inside of which are many rhedia, inside of which are many more cercaria. The cercaria are either released and invade, as I mentioned, the second intermediate host, in which they encyst as metacercaria on that second intermediate host, or they invade directly into the definitive host. So what are examples of this? Well, this particular example is the human liver fluke, Clinorchus sinensis, also called the Chinese liver fluke. And not surprisingly, given its name, common name, they live inside of the liver of humans. And so while they're in the human liver, they're reproducing sexually, releasing embryonic eggs through the feces, which, if those feces are dropped off in the wrong place in the water here, go on to hatch out, and here miracidia in step 2a in either are ingested by the snail or invade the snail's tissues, develop into sporocysts. Each sporocyst has many rhedia. Those are these little globules inside the sporocyst. Each rhedia has many developing cercaria inside of it. Those cercaria release, many of which swim through the water. And if there's a fish nearby, they will attach, encyst into the muscle tissue or the fins of the fish, and then a human comes along and eats that fish raw or undercooked, and that person now is infected with the Chinese liver fluke. This is the same life cycle with a little bit different diagrams to drive this home. So here's the human infected releasing the eggs with miracidia out through the feces into the water. That miracidium is going to infect the snail and become a sporocyst, inside which are many rhedia. In each of these rhedia, there are many cercaria. Here you can see the lot of cercaria released even from one single snail, and then infect the fish. So that's the fairly complicated life cycle of trematode flukes, or the human Chinese liver fluke. Okay. Now, trematodes also lead to other human diseases. One is called schistosomiasis, and that is caused by this particular trematode here, schistosoma. And schistosoma actually has separate sexes, so they're not hermaphroditic like the last worm we showed you. In this case, the separate sexes, the male and female, mate for life and function as a pair here. You can actually see that the female sort of fits into a groove in the body of the male here. And so in this case, in schistosomiasis, a schistosome, such as the species Schistosoma mansoni, will again infect the human, oftentimes in the liver or the hepatic portal system or the bladder, will be released in the waste into the water again. One way you can stop these infections, of course, is to make sure humans aren't releasing their waste into the waterway where others are waiting. But if they do that, then these eggs pass in the feces, will hatch out. The miracidium will find and penetrate a host snail. Inside the snail, again, the sporocysts develop. Rhedia develop inside those. Cercaria released from those. The cercaria, in this case here, is released in the water and penetrates directly into the skin and infects the human. So any human wading in the water here can be infected, and this is a problem in many parts of the world, not really so much in the United States, but in many parts of the world where people wade into the waterways and also obviously defecate into the waterways. You can get some very serious situations here where you have, for example, schistosomal hepatic fibrosis of the liver leading to blood obstruction of blood flow in the liver here, as you can see in the center of this cross-section of the liver. Right, so we've talked about free-living species, including freshwater triclads. Last time, we just finished talking about the class Trematoda. Now I want to talk a little bit about the class Monogenea. And the class Monogenea, like its name suggests, really only has one host. So mono, referring to one. These are ectoparasitic, so they're normally found on the outside of their vertebral hosts, although there's a few that are endoparasites. There's one host, and they're very host-specific, and they have a much more simple life cycle. So, as shown here in the slide, the monogenean has a large posterior attachment organ with hooks and suckers on it. This is called the hapter or the opistapter right here. And that holds on to the outside of a fish usually. There's no intermediate hosts in the life cycle, so there's no replicative phases here. There's no sporocyst and rhedia and cercaria. Just simply this worm that's going to mature into an adult attached on, usually onto the gills of a fish and reproducing. Can certainly cause problems with fish that are being raised in a hatchery. So here, for example, is a fish right here with an adult monogenean fluke, class Monogenea, attached to its gills. It's going to reproduce sexually, releasing egg, which hatches out and forms something we call an Onchomyricidium larva, which then swims through the water and attaches to the next fish and hooks onto its gills and so on. There's our life cycle. Okay, so now we've covered the free-living flatworms, which again are paraphyletic. The trematodes, which are a good group here, a monophyletic group of class. The monogeneans, which are also technically a monophyletic group, although really if you look back here, they're not the right grouping either, because they have a common ancestor they share in common with the final class or group. That is the class Cestoda, or the tapeworm. So we're going to talk about the tapeworms last. There's roughly 3,400 plus species of tapeworms out there. So in a tapeworm, they are specialized for being endoparasitic, living again inside the host, usually in the gut of the host. In fact, they're so specialized in this case that there's no mouth, there's no digestive tract whatsoever. They simply absorb nutrients through the outer body wall. And these guys are really reproductive factories. At one end here, which is actually there's evidence for suggesting it's the tail end, we have what's called the scolex. And if you look at that under a scanning electron microscope here, you can see there's a ring of hooks and a series of 4 suckers on this end to attach to the intestine and hang on as the worm then begins to grow by budding more and more and more of these segment-like regions called proglottids as we move from the immature segments that are recently produced near the scolex all the way back to the back end here, which again is really the front end of the worm. We can see that these proglottids will mature, meaning that they're going to become gravid or full of eggs, and each segment is packed full of eggs to produce more tapeworms. So here, for example, we can see the attachment end, the scolex here, with the rostellum, a ring of hooks and suckers, a sort of short neck here, and then a budding zone where more and more immature proglottids are produced. And then well back from that, we get maturing proglottids here, which are little reproductive factories. Each segment, each proglottid really, they're not complete segments. the segmentation doesn't go through all the way through each body region. But each of these proglottids is hermaphroditic, and so they have both testes and ovaries, so both male and female function. The tapeworm can even self-fertilize, so these segments are then going to begin to produce more and more eggs. And in this next photo here, you can see the ovaries here beginning to mature with eggs in them. Again, this is a tapeworm that's found parasitic inside of the gut of a vertebrate. The body is really just more and more and more proglottids with a scolex attached to the end here. There's no digestive tract, no gut. They're just absorbing nutrients through the skin. They do have a pair of longitudinal nerve cords, much like a regular free-living flatworm. And each proglottid, again, is hermaphroditic, containing both male and female reproductive organs. So here we can see the scolex end here shown blown up here, and the more mature segments. And the typical cestode life cycle is relatively simple. We have a host, a definitive host, which would be, again, the host that holds the sexually mature worms. They will reproduce sexually either with another tapeworm or simply self-fertilize. The eggs then will develop in the gravid proglottids, the largest proglottids, back all the way at the opposite end from the scolex. These segments or proglottids will be released sometimes into the water and eaten by a secondary host, which can then develop what's called an oncosphere larva inside this secondary host. And then sometimes there are 3 or 4 other larval types, so this can get quite complicated before that those larval types make their way back to the definitive host. So here's an example, and we're unfortunately still hitting on this common theme of how they might affect humans. So this is a human tapeworm called Taenia saginata, the beef tapeworm. And it basically involves a human, again, eating raw or undercooked beef, which of course has to be riddled with these cysticerci, these cysts inside of the muscle tissue of the beef. So inspections are critically important for keeping you and I healthy, even if we like to eat raw meat. Once the person eats raw beef, that cyst will evaginate, and you can see here the scolex end will pop out and attach, and it will begin to bud and grow more and more and more and more of these proglottids. And as we get all the way to the opposite end, these segments or proglottids are larger and larger, packed full of eggs, and they can literally just break off and get dropped off in the feces. If you have a dog or a cat with a problem, with a tapeworm problem, you might be noticing that they're leaving what look like little rice grains behind, and those, of course, are probably not rice grains. They're gravid proglottids, chock full of eggs. But if in this case, if the human waste is released and the shelled larvae that are released here that develop from the gravid proglottids, if they are in a field where cows are grazing, well, then the cow can ingest that. The shelled larva will insist in the beef, and then once again, here's the invaginated cysticercus, right? That cyst, if eaten by a human, will repeat the cycle here. So roughly 1% of American cattle are infected. 20% of cattle slaughtered are not inspected, so that could be a problem. 25% of infections are missed during inspection. So we've got a potential problem here, and obviously it's not a problem at all if you don't like your beef rare or raw. In terms of the size of these tapeworms, they can grow to be really remarkably large. The largest tapeworm measured has been roughly 8.8 meters long. That's even taller than a giraffe. That's really quite dramatic. Okay, that's it. That's the finish line here for our phylum Platyhelminthes, class Turbellaria, the free-living ones from last lecture, And from this one, the three different groups here, the monogenea, the trematoda, and the cestoda, that are all parasitic and really make up the majority of flatworms.